The dust settled like judgment on Tom Riker's boots as he walked away from 15 years of loyalty. Behind him, the ranch house stood silent, its windows reflecting nothing but his own betrayal, not of his employer, but of everything he'd once believed about fairness. The boy's small hand clutched his sleeve, a weight heavier than any burden he'd carried across these endless plains. In the distance, smoke rose from Nathan Cole's chimney, a man who'd buried his own dreams so deep that even the desert couldn't find them. Tom had lost everything for doing right, but sometimes the greatest losses carve space for something the heart never dared imagine. The morning sun painted the broken mesa plains in shades of copper and regret as Tom Riker stood at the crossroads between his past and an uncertain future. His weathered hands, calloused from years of honest work, hung empty at his sides. No keys to the bunkhouse, no authority over the cattle, no place to call home. The ranch that had been his world for 15 years now felt like a stranger's land, and every familiar landmark seemed to mock his sudden displacement. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, the same wind that had welcomed him as a young man full of dreams, now pushing him toward an unknown horizon. Behind him, the boy Benji kicked at stones, with the fierce determination of someone trying to make the world hurt as much as he did. The dismissal had come swift and merciless, like a rattlesnake's strike in the desert heat. Old Man Harrison's voice still echoed in Tom's ears, cold and final as winter rain. "You chose that orphan over this ranch, Riker. Now live with your choice." The words had cut deeper than any physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Tom had indeed chosen Benji over his job, his security, his carefully built life. When the boy had appeared at the ranch gates 3 weeks ago, dirty and defiant, claiming his dead father had once worked these lands, Tom had seen something in those fierce young eyes that reminded him of his own childhood. The desperate hunger for belonging, for someone to say you mattered. The other hands had wanted to send the boy to the territorial authorities, but Tom had intervened, offering Benji shelter and small tasks around the ranch. Harrison had tolerated the arrangement for exactly 18 days before his patience snapped like a dry twig. The final confrontation had erupted when Tom refused to hand Benji over to a traveling merchant who claimed he could find the boy useful work in the mining camps, work that everyone knew meant a life of brutal labor and early death. Tom had stood his ground, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through countless storms and hardships. "The boy stays," he had declared, knowing even as the words left his mouth that he was signing his own dismissal papers. Harrison's face had darkened like a thundercloud, and within the hour, Tom found himself packing his few belongings, while Benji watched from the shadows, his young face a mask of guilt and defiance. Now, as they walked the dusty road that led away from everything Tom had known, the weight of his decision pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. His savings amounted to less than $40, barely enough to last a month if they were careful, and winter was approaching with the inevitability of death itself. The boy walked beside him in silence, his small frame carrying a pack that seemed too large for his thin shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could will their destination into existence. Tom glanced at Benji and saw the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, signs of a child trying desperately not to cry, not to show weakness in a world that had already proven its cruelty. The sight stirred something protective and fierce in Tom's chest, a feeling that made his sacrifice feel not like loss, but like the first honest thing he'd done in years. The road stretched before them like a question mark, drawn in dust and stone, leading toward the distant outline of Nathan Cole's property. Tom had heard the stories about Cole, a man who'd lost his wife and children to fever 5 years ago and had retreated so far into solitude that some folks wondered if he'd gone mad with grief. The neighboring ranchers spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a man who worked his land with the intensity of someone trying to outrun his own shadow, who rarely came to town and never spoke to his neighbors unless absolutely necessary. Yet something in those stories, some quality of shared loss and isolation, drew Tom toward Cole's ranch like a moth to a distant flame. Perhaps it was the recognition that desperate men sometimes understood each other in ways that comfortable people never could. Or perhaps it was simply that Cole's ranch represented the only option left on a rapidly narrowing horizon. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of brass and promise, Tom felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with the possibility of rejection and further hardship, but it was also free from the compromises and small betrayals that had slowly eaten away at his soul over the years. Walking beside Benji, carrying nothing but their few possessions and the weight of an uncertain future, Tom realized that sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what truly mattered, and sometimes the greatest courage was found not in holding on, but in the willingness to let go and trust that the horizon held something better than what lay behind. Nathan Cole's ranch emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage of solitude and stubborn survival. The buildings stood weathered but solid against the endless sky, their wood bleached silver by years of sun and wind, telling the story of a man who maintained his property with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions of living. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, a lonely signal in the vast emptiness of the plains, and Tom felt his steps slow as they approached the gate, uncertainty gnawing at his resolve like hunger at an empty belly. The fence posts stood straight and true, the corrals were well maintained, but there was something in the very air around the place that spoke of profound loneliness, of a life lived in the shadow of unbearable loss. Benji pressed closer to Tom's side, his earlier bravado replaced by the instinctive wariness of a child who had learned to read the emotional weather of adults with the skill of a seasoned tracker. The sound of their footsteps on the wooden porch seemed to echo with unnatural loudness in the stillness that surrounded the ranch house. Tom raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how they must look. A displaced ranch hand and a homeless boy, carrying their meager possessions like refugees from their own poor choices. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow that paused and then withdrew, and he knew they were being watched, evaluated, perhaps already dismissed. When he finally knocked, the sound seemed to hang in the air like a question that might never be answered. And the silence that followed stretched so long that Benji shifted nervously from foot to foot, his young face tight with the expectation of yet another rejection. The door remained closed, but Tom could feel the presence on the other side, could sense the weight of consideration and the struggle between isolation and the basic human decency that even the most wounded souls rarely manage to completely abandon. When Nathan Cole finally opened the door, Tom was struck by the man's appearance, tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held the particular emptiness of someone who had seen too much sorrow to ever be completely present in the world. Again, his clothes were clean but worn, practical garments chosen for function rather than appearance, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of a man who worked his land with the intensity of someone trying to exhaust himself into peace. Cole's gaze moved from Tom to Benji and back again, taking in their dusty clothes, their worn boots, the careful way they stood together like allies in an uncertain world. "You're Riker," he said finally, his voice carrying the rusty quality of someone who rarely used it for conversation, and Tom nodded, surprised that his reputation had traveled even to this isolated corner of the territory. "Heard you got yourself fired for taking in a stray," Cole continued, and there was something in his tone that might have been approval, or perhaps just recognition of a familiar kind of foolishness. Tom straightened his shoulders and met Cole's gaze directly, knowing that this moment would determine their fate. The boy needed help, he said simply, refusing to apologize for the choice that had cost him everything, and he saw something flicker in Cole's eyes, a brief spark of what might have been respect, or perhaps just the acknowledgement of one stubborn man recognizing another. Benji stepped forward then, his chin raised with the defiant pride that had become his armor against the world's cruelty, and Tom felt a surge of protective pride at the boy's courage. "I can work," Benji declared, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I won't be any trouble." The words hung in the air between them, a child's desperate offer to earn his place in a world that had shown him little kindness, and Tom saw Cole's expression soften almost imperceptibly, as if the boy's fierce determination had touched something in the man's carefully guarded heart. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might bear their weight or collapse beneath the burden of their combined need and desperation. Cole's eyes moved over their small group again, and Tom could almost see the internal struggle playing out behind those grey eyes, the desire for continued solitude, warring with something deeper, some recognition of shared loss, and the terrible weight of carrying grief alone. The wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet and carrying with it the scent of approaching weather, and Tom realized that they were standing at a crossroads that would determine not just their immediate future, but the shape of whatever life they might build from the ruins of their separate disasters. When Cole finally stepped back and gestured for them to enter, the movement was so subtle that Tom almost missed it. But the invitation was there, grudging and uncertain, but real nonetheless. Inside the ranch house, the silence felt different. Not the oppressive quiet of abandonment, but the careful hush of a man who had learned to live with his own thoughts and found them poor company. The rooms were clean and functional, furnished with the basic necessities of survival, but stripped of anything that might be called comfort or joy, as if Cole had systematically removed every reminder of the life he had lost. Tom noticed the absence of photographs, the empty spaces on walls where pictures might once have hung, the way the furniture was arranged not for conversation or companionship, but for the solitary routines of a man who had forgotten how to live with others. Yet beneath the stark functionality, he sensed something else, a careful maintenance that spoke of a man who still believed in the value of order and dignity, even when life had stripped away everything else that gave it meaning. As Cole moved to put coffee on the stove, his movements precise and economical, Tom felt the first stirring of hope that perhaps they had found not just shelter, but the beginning of something that might, in time, become home. The first week at Nathan Cole's ranch passed like a careful dance between strangers learning each other's rhythms. Tom rose before dawn, his body grateful for the familiar ache of honest work, while Benji shadowed him through morning chores with the intensity of a boy who had learned that safety could vanish without warning. The child's sharp tongue had grown quieter, replaced by watchful eyes that tracked every movement, every gesture, as if memorizing the geography of this new world. Nathan remained a distant figure, appearing at meals with the punctuality of a man who had structured his solitude into rigid patterns, speaking only when necessity demanded it. Yet Tom noticed the way Nathan's gaze lingered on Benji when the boy wasn't looking, a softness creeping into those weathered features, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The ranch itself seemed to exhale with relief at having voices fill its silence again, the buildings standing straighter, the animals moving with less wariness. Tom found himself working with a fierce dedication, as if he could prove his worth through the sweat of his labor. Repair not just fences and barns, but the trust that had been shattered when loyalty had cost him everything he thought he owned. On the 8th morning, Tom discovered Nathan standing in the doorway of what had once been a child's room, his massive frame filling the space like a monument to grief. The room held the ghostly presence of a life interrupted, a small bed with a quilt still folded at its foot, toys arranged on shelves with the precision of a shrine, a rocking horse whose painted eyes seemed to watch the empty air where laughter should have lived. Nathan's hands gripped the doorframe with such force that his knuckles had gone white, and Tom understood with sudden, piercing clarity that this man's isolation was not choice, but survival, a fortress built around a wound too deep for healing. "My boy would have been about Benji's age now," Nathan said without turning, his voice carrying the weight of years spent talking to ghosts. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Tom felt the careful distance they had all maintained begin to crack like ice under spring sun. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort or understanding, but recognized that some sorrows were too sacred for words, too raw for the clumsy bandages of sympathy. Instead, he simply stood witness to Nathan's pain, understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness was the willingness to share the burden of silence. That afternoon, Benji disappeared. Tom searched the barn, the pastures, the creek that wound through the property like a silver thread, calling the boy's name until his voice grew hoarse with panic. Nathan emerged from the house with the grim efficiency of a man accustomed to loss, his eyes already holding the terrible knowledge that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. They found Benji 3 hours later, curled beneath the old oak that marked the boundary between Nathan's land and the vast emptiness beyond, his small body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for his frame. "I thought you'd send me away," the boy whispered when Tom knelt beside him, his words broken by hiccups and the kind of fear that lived in the bones of children who had learned too early that love was temporary. Tom gathered the child against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of Benji's heart like a trapped bird, and understood that they were all refugees from different kinds of abandonment, all seeking shelter in the same fragile hope. Nathan stood apart, his face a mask of controlled emotion, but Tom saw the way his hands trembled slightly, the way he looked at Benji as if seeing his own lost son in the boy's tears. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Tom realized that they had crossed some invisible threshold, that the careful politeness of strangers had given way to something more dangerous and more necessary. The tentative beginnings of a family forged not by blood, but by the shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and still choose to hope. The evening meal that night carried a different quality. The silence, no longer awkward, but contemplative, like the pause between movements in a piece of music. Benji sat closer to Tom, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the man's arm, as if reassuring himself of his presence, while Nathan served generous portions with the careful attention of someone who understood hunger in all its forms. "I had a son once," Nathan said suddenly, his words dropping into the quiet like stones into still water. "Samuel. He'd be 10 this winter if the fever hadn't taken him and his mother 3 years back." The admission hung in the air, raw and honest, and Tom felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that they were no longer strangers sharing space, but wounded souls offering each other the gift of their stories. Benji looked up from his plate, his young face serious with the gravity of someone who understood loss intimately, and said with surprising gentleness, "I'm sorry about your boy, Mr. Cole." Nathan's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed, and he nodded once, sharply, as if accepting not just Benji's sympathy, but the possibility that grief shared might weigh less than grief carried alone. Tom reached across the table and placed his hand over Nathan's weathered fingers, a gesture so simple and so profound that it seemed to change the very air they breathed, transforming the kitchen from a place of solitary meals into the heart of something that might, with time and care, become a home. The night brought with it a thunderstorm that rolled across the plains like the voice of God, shaking the ranch house with its fury and filling the darkness with electric light. Tom woke to find Benji standing in his doorway, small and frightened, clutching a worn blanket like armor against the chaos outside. Without words, Tom lifted the covers and the boy crawled in beside him, his small body trembling with each crash of thunder, and Tom found himself humming an old lullaby his own mother had sung, the melody rising and falling with the rhythm of the rain. Through the thin walls, he could hear Nathan moving restlessly in his room. And Tom understood that storms brought different kinds of fear to each of them. For Benji, the terror of abandonment. For Nathan, the echo of nights spent alone with his grief. For himself, the weight of responsibility for these two broken souls who had somehow become his to protect. As the storm gradually spent its fury and moved on toward the eastern horizon, Tom felt Benji's breathing slow and deepen, the boy's trust settling over him like a benediction. In the growing quiet, he heard Nathan's footsteps pause outside his door, a moment of hesitation that spoke of a man wrestling with his own need for comfort before continuing down the hall. Tom closed his eyes and listened to the gentle patter of rain on the roof, understanding that they were all learning to weather storms together, that perhaps the greatest courage was not in facing the tempest alone, but in admitting that sometimes we all needed shelter in each other's strength. 3 weeks into their unlikely arrangement, the rhythm of their days had settled into something that resembled peace, though Tom knew better than to trust the fragile stability they had built. Benji had begun to laugh again, the sound bright and unexpected as birdsong after winter, usually triggered by some small victory. A successful attempt at milking the cantankerous old cow, a perfectly thrown stone that sent ripples across the creek's surface, or Nathan's rare but genuine smile when the boy mastered some new task. Nathan himself seemed to be thawing like frozen ground under spring sun, his movements less rigid, his silences less defensive. Though Tom noticed, he still avoided the child's room and sometimes caught him staring into the distance with eyes that held too much memory. The work was hard, but satisfying. The kind of labor that left a man tired in his bones, but clean in his conscience. And Tom found himself falling into the ancient rhythms of ranch life with the relief of a man who had finally found his proper place in the world. Yet beneath the surface calm, he sensed currents of change, the way animals sense approaching weather, and he knew that their fragile peace could not last forever in a world that demanded explanations for kindness and justification for mercy. The neighboring ranchers had begun to ask questions, their curiosity sharpening into suspicion as word spread of Nathan Cole's unexpected guests, and Tom felt the weight of their scrutiny like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. The trouble came, as trouble often does, on a day that had begun with promise. Tom was teaching Benji to repair fence posts when they saw the dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. 3 riders, moving with the purposeful gait of men on official business. Nathan emerged from the barn, his face already hardening into the mask of controlled hostility he wore when dealing with the outside world, and Tom felt his stomach tighten with the familiar dread of a man who had learned that authority rarely brought good news to those who lived on the margins. The riders were led by Sheriff Morrison, a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of rigid righteousness that made him dangerous to anyone who didn't fit neatly into his understanding of proper behavior, flanked by 2 deputies whose hands rested too casually on their gun belts. "Afternoon, Cole," Morrison said without dismounting, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with the calculating assessment of a man looking for violations. "Heard you've taken in some strays. Town's got concerns about a known troublemaker corrupting a child, especially one who's got no legal guardian to speak for his welfare." The words hit Tom like physical blows, each syllable designed to wound, and he felt Benji press closer to his side, the boy's small hand gripping his shirt with desperate fingers. Nathan stepped forward, his massive frame radiating quiet menace, and Tom saw something flicker in the sheriff's eyes. Not quite fear, but a recognition that Nathan Cole was not a man to be pushed without consequence. "The boy's under my protection," Nathan said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, and Tom felt something shift in the air between them, a line being drawn that could not be uncrossed. "Any man who's got a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The sheriff's smile was thin and cold, the expression of a man who had been hoping for exactly this kind of confrontation, and Tom realized with sinking certainty that they had walked into a trap that had been months in the making. That's real noble of you, Cole, but the law's the law. Boy needs proper schooling, proper supervision, not the influence of a man who got himself fired for insubordination and theft. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Tom felt his hands clench into fists, the old anger rising in his chest like floodwater. But before he could speak, Benji stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong despite the tremor Tom could hear beneath the words. "Mr. Riker never stole nothing," the boy said, his chin raised in defiance that would have been comical if it weren't so heartbreaking. "He lost his job because he wouldn't let them hurt me. And Mr. Cole's been kinder to me than anyone ever was, so you can just take your law and—" Nathan's hand fell gently on the boy's shoulder, silencing him with a touch that spoke of protection and pride in equal measure. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion, understanding that in this moment Benji had chosen them as surely as they had chosen him, that whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, each man measuring the others, calculating odds and consequences, while the afternoon sun beat down on them with merciless intensity. Tom could feel sweat trickling down his back, could hear the nervous shifting of horses and the distant lowing of cattle, could sense the weight of decision pressing down on all of them like the atmosphere before a tornado. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, a gesture so casual it might have been unconscious, but Tom saw Nathan's eyes narrow and knew that the big man was ready for whatever violence might come. "You've got no legal claim on the boy," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. "And harboring a known vagrant makes you complicit in whatever crimes he might commit. I'm taking them both back to town, where they belong." No, the words fell like a death sentence, and Tom felt the familiar despair rising in his chest, the knowledge that good intentions meant nothing in a world that valued property over people, order over mercy. But then Nathan stepped forward, his movement deliberate and final, and Tom saw something in the man's face that made his breath catch. Not resignation, but resolution. The look of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Over my dead body," Nathan said quietly, and the simple words carried such absolute conviction that even the sheriff seemed to hesitate. Tom felt Benji's hand slip into his, small fingers intertwining with his own, and understood that they had reached the moment where everything would change, where the careful balance they had built would either hold or shatter completely. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken finally by the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the direction of the main road. Tom turned to see another rider approaching, an older man on a grey horse, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had no need to prove his authority through speed or bluster. As the figure drew closer, Tom recognized Judge Whitman, a man whose reputation for fairness had survived 30 years on the bench, his weathered face carrying the kind of wisdom that came from seeing too much of human nature in all its forms. The judge dismounted slowly, his movements careful with age, and nodded to each man in turn with the courtesy of someone who understood that respect was earned, not demanded. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades weighing the scales of justice, "I believe we have a situation that requires some discussion." Sheriff Morrison's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, clearly not having expected this intervention, while Nathan remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the judge with the intensity of a man whose entire future hung in the balance. Tom felt hope stir in his chest, like the first green shoots of spring, understanding that perhaps their story was not yet finished, that sometimes the law could be more than just a weapon in the hands of small men with smaller minds. Judge Whitman's gaze settled on Benji, and Tom saw something soften in those ancient eyes, a recognition of innocence that deserved protection rather than persecution. Judge Whitman's presence transformed the confrontation from a battle of wills into something resembling a court of law, his mere arrival shifting the balance of power in ways that made Sheriff Morrison's bluster seem petty and small. The old judge listened with the patience of a man who had learned that truth rarely emerged in the first telling, his weathered hands folded over the pommel of his saddle as each man stated his case. Tom found himself speaking with a clarity born of desperation, laying bare the circumstances that had led him to this moment, the choice between his job and his conscience, the discovery of Benji abandoned and afraid, the unexpected sanctuary Nathan had offered when the world had turned its back on them both. Nathan's testimony was briefer, but no less powerful. His simple declaration that the boy belonged with them, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Benji himself stood straight and proud, his young voice steady as he spoke of kindness received and loyalty freely given, his words painting a picture of family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. Sheriff Morrison's arguments seemed to wither under the judge's steady gaze, his accusations of vagrancy and corruption sounding increasingly hollow when measured against the evidence of 3 lives that had found healing in each other's company. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard, and Tom felt the weight of their collective future hanging in the balance, like a scale that could tip either toward justice or toward the kind of legal cruelty that destroyed lives in the name of order. When Judge Whitman finally spoke, his words carried the authority of Solomon rendering judgment, each syllable measured and deliberate. "I've seen enough broken families in my time to recognize when something's been put back together right," he said, his eyes moving from Tom to Nathan to Benji, with the careful assessment of a man who understood that the law was meant to serve humanity, not the other way around. This boy's got 2 men willing to stand between him and the world's cruelty, willing to sacrifice their own comfort for his welfare. That's more than most children can claim, orphaned or otherwise. Sheriff Morrison's face darkened with frustrated anger, his mouth opening to protest, but the judge's raised hand silenced him with the finality of a gavel. "As for the matter of guardianship, I'm prepared to grant temporary custody to Nathan Cole, pending a formal hearing in 30 days. That should give everyone time to consider what's truly in the boy's best interests." The words hit Tom like a physical blow, relief and gratitude washing over him in waves so powerful they left him dizzy. Benji let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the plains, his small body practically vibrating with excitement, while Nathan's face showed the first genuine smile Tom had seen since their arrival. The sheriff and his deputies departed with the sullen resentment of men who'd been outmaneuvered by superior wisdom, their dust cloud disappearing toward town like a retreating storm. Judge Whitman lingered long enough to share a cup of Nathan's coffee and offer quiet words of encouragement, his presence a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, was not always denied. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation and hope, as they worked to transform their informal arrangement into something that could withstand legal scrutiny. Nathan threw himself into the task of making the ranch a proper home for a growing boy, his grief-stiffened heart gradually opening like a flower after rain. The child's room was cleaned and aired, its shrine-like stillness replaced by the cheerful chaos of a living boy's possessions. Benji's few belongings, mixed with new purchases from town, books and clothes and toys that spoke of a future worth planning for. Tom found himself serving as mediator between Nathan's fierce protectiveness and Benji's natural exuberance, helping them navigate the delicate process of becoming a family without the benefit of blood ties or legal precedent. The boy thrived under their combined attention, his sharp tongue softening into genuine affection, his defensive wariness melting away as he learned to trust in the permanence of their commitment. Neighbors who had once viewed Nathan with suspicion began to nod respectfully when they encountered the unlikely trio in town, recognizing something in their unity that transcended conventional understanding. Tom felt his own wounds beginning to heal, the bitter taste of betrayal gradually replaced by the sweet satisfaction of purpose rediscovered. The ranch itself seemed to respond to their renewed energy, buildings standing straighter, animals moving with less skittishness, the very land seeming to exhale with relief at having a family to nurture once again. The formal hearing arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn morning. Judge Whitman's courtroom filled with curious townspeople who had come to witness the resolution of what had become the most talked-about case in recent memory. Tom sat in the front row, his hands clenched with nervous energy, watching as Nathan and Benji took their places before the bench with the dignity of people who had nothing to hide and everything to gain. The proceedings were mercifully brief, a parade of character witnesses speaking to Nathan's integrity and Tom's devotion, their testimonies painting a picture of 3 lives that had found completion in each other's company. Even some of Tom's former colleagues from the ranch appeared, their grudging respect for his principles overcoming their fear of association with a troublemaker. Sheriff Morrison made one last attempt to argue for the boy's removal, his words falling flat in the face of overwhelming evidence that Benji had found not just shelter, but genuine love in his unconventional home. When Judge Whitman finally rendered his decision, granting Nathan permanent guardianship and dismissing all charges against Tom, the courtroom erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Tom felt tears streaming down his face, the salt taste of joy replacing the bitter flavor of injustice that had poisoned his mouth for so long. Benji launched himself into Nathan's arms with the abandon of a child who finally understood that he was truly safe, while Nathan's own tears fell freely for the first time since his son's death, washing away years of carefully maintained isolation. They walked out of that courtroom as a family in the eyes of the law, but Tom knew they had been a family in their hearts long before any judge had given them permission to love each other. The celebration that night was quiet but profound. The 3 of them gathered around Nathan's kitchen table, sharing a meal that tasted of victory and hope in equal measure. Benji chatted excitedly about his plans for the future. The horse Nathan had promised to teach him to ride, the school he would attend in town, the adventures that awaited them as a family. Nathan listened with the patient attention of a man who had rediscovered the joy of planning for tomorrow, his weathered face soft with contentment as he watched the boy who had brought life back to his empty house. Tom felt a peace settle over him like a warm blanket, the knowledge that he had finally found his place in the world, not as a hired hand working for wages, but as part of something larger and more meaningful than he had ever dared to hope for. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, its familiar sounds and smells a lullaby of belonging. And Tom understood that sometimes the greatest journeys were not about reaching new destinations, but about discovering that home had been waiting for you all along. As they prepared for bed, Benji paused in the doorway of his room, no longer a shrine to the past, but a sanctuary for the future, and looked back at the 2 men who had chosen to love him when the world had turned away. "Thank you," he said simply, his young voice carrying the weight of gratitude too large for words, and Tom felt his heart swell with the knowledge that they had all saved each other, that in choosing to protect one small boy, they had found the courage to rebuild their own broken lives into something beautiful and strong and lasting.